Hey there, everybody. How's it going? Appreciate having me here today and speaking to you all on how Red raises the bar. First of all, special thanks to Mystico for having me here and to speak to everybody. Hopefully you have a good time on this presentation, and feel free always to hit me up if you have any questions after this at Hacking Dave on social media or on Discord or a lot of other areas that I'm always hanging out with. But this talk today, probably one of my favorites because it's, I think, one of the biggest issues that we struggle with in the security industry. So this talk could be a combination of both, super technical and getting into the weeds, as well as, kind of what the problems are, I think, in our industry and what we can do to really fix it. As of late, there's been a lot of discussion around offensive security tools and, do we release them? Do we release exploits? All these different things. And I think, you look back historically to where we were to where we are now, there's no question that, when we start to look at how red impacts blue and how offense affects defense, all of those different things really work together to really bring you a big picture of what we're dealing with today. So we'll be talking about that a little bit and getting into understanding how defense works today, how we can circumvent the defensive mechanisms in organizations. And what I focus on, a lot of my areas of expertise is going to organizations that are just starting off small, all the way to some of the most elite defensive security programs that we've ever seen in our time, and really trying to figure out ways of getting around them, both from a red teaming perspective as well as exploit research or things to that effect. So, again, hit me up with any questions that you have as we start to go through this. My name is Dave Kennedy. I've been in the security industry for over 25 years. Started my career off working in the military intelligence side of the house, where I did cyber warfare. Got out and was everything from a chief security officer to a Fortune 1000 company to releasing a number of the open source exploitation frameworks that a lot of folks use. I wrote the penetration testers framework, co-authored the book Metasploit, the penetration testers guide. Wrote the social engineer toolkit, Magic Unicorn, Trevor C2, artillery on the defensive side of the house. So I've been on the open source development side and helping out, on offensive security tools as well as defensive security tools for over 20 years. I'm on the news quite frequently on Fox and CNN and CNBC and BBC and any of the ones you can probably think of, talking about cybersecurity related issues. I helped create the penetration testing execution standard with a number of other folks. Helped out the TV show Mr. Robot, and I've been in a Chris Brown rap video, believe it or not, where I was a hacker in the background, basically typing on a fake keyboard that wasn't doing anything and pretending to be a hacker in the background. So I've done a lot of things, but most, where my area of expertise is and what I really like focusing on is understanding offensive capabilities of adversaries and how do we get better as an industry to better defend against them as time goes on. I also, in my spare time, rebuild a DeLorean. I'm a huge Back to the Future fan. So my dream as a kid was always to have a DeLorean. And I, about a year and a half ago, bought a DeLorean. It was in kind of really poor shape, and I've been restoring it over time and building it to the Back to the Future machine. So you see here, here's some pictures of the restoration process as it's kind of gone through. On the top left side, for the folks that care about this, I promise I'll get the security here in just a second. The top left, I actually have foggers built into it with lights, and it'll shoot fog out of the front, and it'll also shoot fog where, if you see in the bottom right hand side where the Mr. Fusion is, it'll shoot fog out there as well. So I have like foggers that kind of go in different locations and tubing through all of that. And then on the bottom left is where I get most of the questions. The car isn't actually hovering. These are like fake wheels that are cut in half that basically mount over the real wheels. If you look really closely in like the back right-hand side there, you can see like the wheels that are still there. It just gives it a nice little hovering effect as things go along. But everything on the right, is programmable, so you can actually customize what date you want to go to. I really spent a lot of time trying to make it as accurate as possible to the screen itself, and it's been just kind of a fun project. I also do a lot of weightlifting and powerlifting and things like that as well, spare time hobby stuff. But my passions are obviously security, building DeLoreans, and lifting weights, and family and friends and stuff like that. So, but that's not why we're here today. We're here today to talk about security and really kind of some of the shifts and changes that we've seen. So I want to go back 10 years ago really quick, where security was very different. And we had, the past versus now, we had, different groups that we would hang around with. I remember, I'd be in IRC all the time. I was part of the remote exploit team. I was part of the backtrack development team, the exploit DB development team. We would share tools and attacks and things like that we wouldn't share with anybody else publicly. We would have 0 days that we would share back and forth together. And red was really, when I say red, I'm talking offense. Offense was really closed off. We really didn't share our secret sauce or our tools or the things like that. And what ended up happening is the industry, from a defensive perspective, really had a tough time with that because, all these hackers had these tools and these weapons and these exploits and things like that. They would rip through defenses. And then, ultimately what would happen is, you'd go into a pen test, for example, a company would get a pen test done and you just absolutely destroy them the first day or second day. And then you'd have, maybe 5 more days on site and you'd literally just write another tool or write something cool or do some research or something like that. That's why I like to call that the easy days, because, like usually like the first hour or two you're in, you already have access to everything. You can literally write an entire report and there you can just mess with their systems and just like write new tools or exploits. I mean, I can remember, probably half of the social engineer toolkit or, half of Magic Unicorn was written on a customer site because I've already finished my engagement pretty much, in the early stages of it. I was just tweaking things or making things better or getting around certain defensive tools. And so that was kind of what I would call the glory days, because, it was super easy to rip into computer systems. But what happened, from a shifting perspective, and I think this, it's obviously better. I think we're in a better state than we were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Is that, we started sharing collaboratively with Blue. We started working on, instead of focusing less on fixing, the initial root causes or what we would consider initial access, if you look kind of like the whole chain of attacks, we started looking at, hey, how do we stop an attack if it's successful in our organization? So if you look at the post-exploitation scenarios, like everything from initial access to privilege escalation or persistence, command and control, lateral movement across an environment, exfiltration of data, you go through those varying stages of attacks. What do those look like? And how can we either A, prevent them, or B, detect them so that we can respond much more effectively throughout the attack itself and reduce the amount of damage to an organization? And so this collaboration or this relationship between Red and Blue started to happen. And again, that's a very good thing. Red sharing their capabilities or their techniques, their tools, how they go after an organization, and focusing not just on that initial exploit that got you access, which is still important if you have flaws, but also focusing on all those other stages. What does pass the hash look like? What does, unconstrained delegation look like? What does, Kerber roasting look like? What does local link multicast name resolution look like, or NBNS attacks against the infrastructure for using a password theft? What do these attacks look like, and how do we stop them in our environment? What does Mimikatz look like when you're injecting into LSAS to extract, clear text passwords from Digest? All of these different ways that attackers would approach going after an organization from a post-exploitation perspective were now in the hands of and communicated to defenders. And so we had this era where, we started seeing some massive increases in security. And I always look at us from an industry perspective as I feel like we always go the hard way of things. And I'll talk about most organizations here in a second, but most organizations are still at a very basic level of security, because what happened is, we shared all of these tools and techniques and all of these other things, in a collaborative way, but most organizations don't focus on continuously building their security program. What they do is they buy an EDR product or they buy an MSSP, a service from an organization, and they expect their security to be magically fixed, right? When they have historical issues throughout their entire organization, they're not doing the fundamental principles. They're not even doing basic things like multi-factor authentication. And they're expecting all of these things to be fixed by a single product. And what we'll find very quickly is that, these products are commodity. It's what I would consider, a basic or average hacker could figure out ways to get around these types of products, whether it's an EDR product or whether it's an antivirus component or endpoint protection product. If you have enough understanding around how these products work, circumventing and getting around them is typically trivial. Now, some are harder than others. Some of them become a little bit more difficult, but in most cases, when you're going against an organization that has a specific product, if you're a decent attacker, from a threat modeling perspective, if I'm a decent attacker going after this organization with just this tool, for me to circumvent that, at least I know what I'm getting into. I know what I'm going after. I can test it beforehand. I can ensure that my attacks, go unevaded or undetected. I can craft things or manipulate them or obfuscate in certain ways to get around those specific detection criteria. I know exactly what I can go after. When you start getting into organizations, though, that have understood their environments, where they have built out their environment, they understand how their environment works. They, focus on network segmentation, least privileged access. They focus on monitoring and detection from their own environment, not specifically from a tool or commodity or from a specific TCP that was found in a different organization. It starts to become very difficult to navigate that as an attacker. And so, what we have to look at is, why aren't organizations, investing with stuff that's already out there? And how do we, in the offensive side, still continue to contribute to make organizations that are continuously investing in security better, but also recognize that there's going to be potential, damages to organizations that don't. And why I bring this up is, most recently, there was a security consulting firm that had a 0-day that they used within their engagements. And, it blew the minds of a lot of people. Why wouldn't this security company actually release this exploit, to get fixed? And, I definitely tend to veer on the side of responsible disclosure, notify the vendor then fixes it, gets it out to his customers. That's one less exploit that you have. In the case of this one, though, they were using it for targeted red teams. And there's a very big difference between a penetration test and a red team, or a purple team, which would be more on the emulation side of the house, versus what an actual simulation is, going after an organization to specifically simulate a specific adversary, most specifically someone that has the capabilities of developing 0 days. And so, we deal with organizations that are very much in that level, that what I would consider less than 1% type of level for elite security, an elite security program. And so for those types of organizations, they want us to use 0 days against their organization because they don't care about the initial access point. They want to demonstrate that it's possible so that they can continue to get funding for their program to continuously advance it. But they also want to show that, hey, once you have access to my environment, even from that 0 day, what does post-exploitation scenarios look like? And where do we have weaks and gaps in our visibility? I'll give you a good story. We were targeting a financial institution, a real high-end security program, very difficult to break into. It took us 6 months of research, found a 0 day weaponized, command and control infrastructure that was completely undetected by any endpoint protection product still listed this day, still hasn't been detected not once. And we used, undocumented deserialization techniques for remote code execution, stealth, command and control infrastructure, domain fronting through services that haven't been discovered. I mean, like the whole attack chain was just beautiful, right? Like we had everything from remote code execution all the way to command and control established 100% perfectly. And we knew their security stacks through open source intelligence gathering, what they were using from a product perspective. And we got into their environment. And what was interesting is, we wanted to see what network we're on. Now, when you're looking at attacking an organization, operational security or OPSEC is really, really important. And you don't want to just start running commands, especially from a parent-child process relationship, or what we call Markov chaining. Markov chaining from a detection perspective is very important, especially for organizations that have actually baselined their environment and look for deviations of patterns of behavior. Like, for example, if you see export.exe, which is spun under the context of a regular user account, kick off Outlook.exe, which then kicks off Excel.exe, which then kicks off Command.exe. Well, obviously something's wrong there. What they had done, though, which was really interesting, is that they had baselined their users into two different categorizations. One was, are they technical or non-technical? So if you had had an IT role or a web developer role, or something to that effect, you would get a technical designation through Active Directory. If you were sales or marketing or things like that, you would get a non-technical designation for that. And then they basically mapped out anything that a technical person would do directly to a non-technical person and flag off of any deviations of those. So for example, if you dropped into a command shell, which we don't typically ever do, because regularly that's a common thing, especially if you're using things like net commands, those types of things. Typically, if you have a good program, you're going to see those being executed and hopefully alert on those detections from an anomalous behavior perspective. But one thing that we did is we just simply, looked at an IP config to see what network we were on. Didn't drop into a command shell, just looked at IP config just to see what network we were on to figure it out. And they had that non-technical flag trigger on that specific system, and their IR team started focusing very heavily on this box, and they figured us out and they booted us out within about 10 minutes of being on the system. So this whole amazing attack that we did, all of this 6 months worth of work was shut down in 10 minutes by us messing up on IP config, because we didn't know, when you get into a customized detection area, you have no idea what these landmines are. You're really trying to navigate and figure things out. Now, there are certain ways around this. For example, you can go into a assumption that you're going to be detected. So what's the story you're going to tell the security analyst or the SOC analyst that is actually, reviewing the alarms? So there are certain stories you can tell as you're going through, knowing that you may get detected through certain commands. So we have to think about that consciously if we're going after a mature organization to say, well, hey, can we make this look like something legitimate in some way, shape, or form versus obfuscation. I'll talk about that here in just a second for detection commodities. I'll give you an actual demo of that. So we look at the past versus now, very different, right? We actually have organizations that do security very well. We have that's actually possible. You talk about, network segmentation, not allowing workstation or workstation communication, going more towards, web applications for your users, instead of having full access to a VPN, minimization of ports and protocols, not allowing direct server access. You always hear that zero trust thing. Well, it does apply. I hate the buzzword, but it does apply from a methodologies perspective or a way of thinking of just really reducing your attack surface to make it harder for attackers. Now, you look at cloud as an interesting piece here. A lot of research being done in cloud. You look at what Durkeon's doing and a lot of the other folks out there. Cloud has a lot of problems, especially from misconfiguration perspective. So, I think a lot of people are thinking, hey, we're going to go cloud centric, and that's going to eliminate a lot of our attack surface. But now you see all this research going into cloud infrastructure, and a lot of these organizations are not prepared to even handle that from a basics perspective. So we have a long way to go, but it's possible. Whereas 10 years ago, I can't remember one customer that I ever touched that I would say had a good security program, right? It was always possible for us to hack into them in some way, shape, or form. Whereas it starts to get very challenging now. I'll go back to that topic on the bank that we went into. We found other ways of getting access to them. Like, for example, they had really good coverage in their Windows environment, but their Mac and Linux environments didn't have good coverage. So what do we target next time? Targeted their Mac and Linux environments. We had a lot of success in that infrastructure, which allowed them to get better, right? So there's a lot of things that we can do from an offensive capabilities perspective to always drive that program forward. But again, the uproar around a company holding on to a 0-day for a year, I understand why there was concern there. Again, I lean more towards responsible disclosure than not. But at the end of the day, if they're trying to simulate red team capabilities against direct adversaries that have nation state capabilities, for example, and might I add, and a lot of the ransomware groups are getting these same types of capabilities as well from a 0-day perspective. So you're really simulating those specific types of groups. You have to have the same type of capabilities. So we get yelled at for releasing offensive security tools, but then when we keep them in, we get yelled at again. So it doesn't make any sense where that's at. Trust me, you want red to be more transparent, to help provide new tools, techniques, research, to provide these types of services, or else we're going to go back to what I'd like to consider the glory days for red teams, where we kept everything internal and just shared between close-knit teams. And now blue is completely defenseless against everything that we're doing. And again, I would say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there's not a company I would say had a good security program. Today, again, that's contrastly different. Now, it's not everybody, it's not the large majority, but there's a lot more companies that are investing in security than not anymore. And that's a very good thing. So we look at different levels of an organization. Let me get to a demonstration here in a second. I would consider that most organizations fall into the basic security organization side of the house. No formalized security program. They lack basic principles like monitoring detection or any type of visibility into their environment. They lack multi-factor authentication. Again, most organizations unfortunately fit in this, especially if you start going into the small to medium-sized business areas. This is really a problem for a lot of companies. And that's where I think in security we're failing a lot, is not providing easy, simplistic things for basic security organizations to do. And I do blame a lot of this on Microsoft. You look at some of their default security settings for when you sign up for things like Office 365 or Microsoft 365, it's very difficult to navigate even basic security principles through there. And, I understand the security defaults are on by default, but that doesn't incorporate multi-factor authentication unless suspicious activity is detected. So, some things can be addressed by changing behavior in default applications and how default applications work. Like, for example, macros, disable them by default, allow the organizations to reopen them up if they absolutely have to. Multi-factor authentication, enable by default, allow them to open up if they have to. But, really trying to get more towards security-centric defaults versus, kind of open from the get-go. Same thing for like LLMNR or MBNS, like disable them by default, allow them to really enable it if it's absolutely needed from a multicast perspective. Average security organizations do fundamental patch management, normal patching of workstation operating systems, maybe some third parties, typically have multi-factor authentication deployed, maybe not to all their assets, and have some sort of commodity detection, like an endpoint detection and response tool or EDR, or an MSSP may incorporate some offensive testing, like maybe like a penetration test yearly, probably for compliance reasons. When we start getting into the above average security organizations, this is a very small percentage. customize detections based off of their own environment. That's the key right there, is making it their own, understanding what's normal in our environment, what's not, and then having detections across the board to say, hey, this is unusual activity from a regular user. Like, for example, does Bob in sales ever execute PowerShell? No. Okay, trigger an alarm anytime it happens, or disable PowerShell completely from regular user accounts if we're not using it, across our environment. So this is the above security type of organization that incorporates some sort of offensive testing regularly and are in varying stages of the security program. Their monitor detection program may be, beginner, intermediate, advanced, but typically this is what I would consider more of a above average, going above commodity in a specific tool. The elite security organizations, that's less than 1% of what we see personally. This is just us from a global security company perspective, dealing with Fortune, 1,000 companies, Fortune, 50, Fortune 10, Fortune 5s, global organizations. We do work all over the world. I would say that sub 1% are in the elite categorization, and they have all of the other things that we talked about before. But their whole focus is understanding threat models towards their organization and building detection capabilities that encompass all of the different aspects of an attack, and then continual offensive testing to identify gaps and weaknesses. That is what I would consider the elite security organization. And also focus on things like minimization of attack surface, making sure that they have standardization across the entire enterprise. Those types of things have become very difficult to do from a culture that may not be security centric in nature. So the current state of security is most organizations are at a basic level of security. They do not invest what they need to in the right areas to really skyrocket their security programs. Leadership is a major problem in our industry. Most CISOs that I've seen have no security background whatsoever. And I'm not saying that is absolutely a showstopper in any way, shape, or form. A good leader, has a good supporting team to help them make good decisions. So you trust your team, right? To be able to say, hey, this is the way we should go. But I do think that, having more security knowledge around how to build a security program or how security works with an organization is really necessary. And I've seen some really poor leadership, unfortunately, in this industry, and people that aren't even part of security or may have a different type of degree. There's definitely exceptions to the rule that I've seen. I've seen a lot of great leaders that have never been in security and that listen to, their entire team, and they forge a path that way based off of their team's recommendations. That's a sign of a good leader. But I often think that you have to have some good security. I'm not saying you have to be technical, but I'm saying that, you should have some security experience if you're leading an entire organization around security, especially business risk in a security organization. So where we're at today is if you can understand programming, if you can take tools that are commodity today that are on the shelf, whether that's Cobalt Strike or Unicorn or Metasploit or whatever else, and you can manipulate or modify that in some way, shape, or form, you can typically get around most of these security organizations. We're talking about most of the security organizations. We're talking about the basic and average security programs, which make up probably around 85% of the organizations out there today, maybe 80%. So 80% of organizations, if you're I would say an average hacker, you could typically break into around 80% of the companies or organizations, which is contrastly different than again 15 years ago, where it was 100% of the organization. So we're doing better. We're not great, but it's better than before. So especially if you build your own C2, build your own attack, type of attacks that only is specific to you. Good luck. You're going to go undetected, unevaded for however long you want, probably years, which is fantastic. I'll tell you a story really quick here. I'm going to show you a demo. I wrote a tool called Magic Unicorn, which I'm going to show you just a little bit of that here in just a second. And the Magic Unicorn, the problem with that one is that, it looks like obfuscated code. So it takes Metasploit shellcode or Cobalt Strike shellcode. It'll chunk it up. It'll obfuscate it, and then it'll repackage it and redo it so that you can do memory injection through shellcode through PowerShell. And when I came with this attack, there was a way to do what's called the x86 downgrade attack, which targets both 32 and 64-bit platforms natively through the syswa64 directory. Anyways, in that specific type of model, the problem is Unicorn became very popular. And so every week, Microsoft and other, antivirus products would release new signatures every week for the detections that I'd write. And I'd automate it and I'd push new things out and things like that. So, it became one of those things where, it was this cat and mouse game back and forth. Well, you look at a different tool that I wrote, which is called Trevor C2. And Trevor C2 looks like a more legitimate application. It doesn't have code obfuscation in it. And that has only had one detection written in the 4 years ago that I wrote it. And I just changed I changed a variable that was encrypted stream to encrypted streams. It circumvented that detection criteria, and there hasn't been a detection written ever since then. And so, we can base our tools to be a little bit more believable in some way, shape, or form, and usually get around most of the detection criteria out there. But again, if we can write our own tools, it's a good chance that we get around most of the stuff out there. So when we look at examples of detections today, here's a good example of how easy and trivial it typically is to get around. Now, obviously, this is an antivirus example, but it's very applicable to EDRs or anything else that's out there. Again, if you have the product to be able to test it through, or you have resources that automatically submit it without submitting the things like VirusTotal that community share it, you can obviously see whether or not you're going to get detected in some way, shape, or form from a lot of these. We do a lot of this, through like Snap Labs and things like that, where we can actually, pop up a virtual machine, test it out, test our detections, stop the actual reporting back to their cloud mechanisms and see what's actually occurring, so that we know that we can get around the specific tooling that we're going after. But in this specific case, this is an example of Windows Defender, and this, is whatever version of Windows you want to use, whether it's 11 or 10. And regSVR32 is what we call a living off the land binary script, or a LOLBIN. And so with a living off the land, it's a legitimate application within Windows that's code side by Windows, that typically has additional functionality. That could be download, that could be execute, that could be whatever you want it to be. And so in this specific case here, if you were to Google how to misuse regSVR32, or if you go to the LOLBAS project, who's run by a number of great folks like Odvar Mo, and those folks there that run that project, you can see all of the living off the lands. There's CertUtil, there's CSC.exe, CBD.exe, map inject, run DLL32, MSHTA. There's a number of different living off the lands that are very useful from an attack surface perspective. And so when we look at how we use regSVR32, if you Google how to use regSVR32 to download and execute something malicious, you're going to get a command very similar to this. So in this specific case here, why it's important to understand is that in this specific case here, this is a commodity attack. It's already been discovered. It's already been published. Who originally discovered this was Casey Smith or SubT. And what's happening here is we're going and downloading a text file that contains what's called a scriptlet object. And a scriptlet object is just a small blurb or code that can execute. We're parsing it with the scriptlet object DLL. And so what will happen here is regSVR32 will reach out to a website, whatever website we want to. It'll download that text file, and then it'll execute that with the scriptlet object, then thus executing our code. So it allows us to get remote code execution off of a system if we have remote code execution. Now, why this is important is, let's just say we're targeting or attacking a system, and we get in through Excel via macros, and we don't want to use PowerShell on the system because we're concerned about being detected. LOLBINs are a way of getting around application control, because it's code signed by Microsoft or other third parties that have this type of functionality. And it also kind of helps us go unevaded. Now, I would argue regSVR32 is probably one of the most abused, so you typically probably don't want to use that one as an example if a company has good detection programs. But in this case here, when we run regSVR32 and we parse it with the scriptlet object, we get an access is denied, and then Windows Defender trips it up and says, hey, this isn't right. This is malicious. Now, what boggles my mind here too, and again, a lot of great stuff coming out of Microsoft from a security perspective, but what boggles my mind here is that instead of removing this malicious functionality where it can download and execute, they basically write a very fragile detection for it, or a preventative mechanism, prevention, that is very easy and trivial to get around. So again, if you're an average hacker or even a basic hacker that's just getting started in this industry, getting around this detection is pretty easy. The way that we do this is that we chunk it up into two different commands, or we do a few different things. There's a number of different ways. This is just one example. You can rename the scriptlet object to blah.dll. That gets around this detection. You can copy it, obviously, from the System32 directory as a regular user to the current directory that you're in, which typically doesn't trigger any alarms, have that execute. And you can run this exact same command just by typing, copy, C:\Windows /System32 /STROBJ.dll to current directory. And then and regSVR32 /s/n/u /i HTTP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We just call blah.dll instead of, strobj.dll. That'll also get around this detection. In this specific case here, we're using bitsadmin. We can use a number of ways. I think curl is in the most recent versions of Windows. You can use curl. You can use Excel. If you use Excel, you just type in excel.exe from the command line and have that with a URL on it. It'll actually download that file to a temp directory. There's a number of different ways to download something from the internet. In this specific case here, you can notice that we're using BitsAdmin to download our test file instead of using registr32. And then we just do a second command. We're just doing the 2 ampersands there for the second command. And then we do registr32/s/u/i. And then we're just calling that text document, which then calls our scriptlet object, parses it with the scriptlet object DLL, and then we completely circumvent this detection. Again, the fragility of these detections, whether it's a preventative mechanism or a detective mechanism, are literally very minute things that you have to change to get around them, because they're previously defined attacks that have been seen or researched, or researchers have released them. And the fragility of these are very simple. I'll give you another example here. If I go to my Windows machine here, or my Linux machine here, and it crashed on me, I think. No, it didn't. All right, hopefully you can see that. So we boot up real quick here. Actually, I'll just get out of big screen so it did crash. I just switched to ARM recently, and funny story on that, I was giving a podcast, and my whole computer locked up as I was doing in my video, everything right in the middle of a presentation. So hopefully that doesn't happen this time. So I'm not going to go to full screen again, because I don't want to tempt the gods there, the demo gods. But what I'm going to show you here is the difference between obfuscation and changing. Now, one of the tools, let me blow this up a little bit here for everybody. One of the tools I write is called Unicorn, and Unicorn is a PowerShell exploitation framework. Now, what's interesting about this is, I'll just use Meterpreter as an example. I'll just put a fake IP address in there, it's not going to matter. And what's interesting about Unicorn is that it got around the encoded command detection. If you're familiar with detections, a lot of times in PowerShell, common commands like encoded command -e, -ec, -enc, invoke expression or IEX, those types of things get detected. So when I wrote Unicorn, this got around it by basically using what was called 2 strings to reassemble encoded command later on down the thing, getting around the detection criteria for encoded command. Additionally, we use Rasta Mouse's, it's been modified to get around antivirus, the AMSI bypass. So for AMSI, if you're familiar with the anti-malware scan interface, this will basically disable AMSI in the current process that you're running and then execute the rest of your code, so you don't have to worry about getting around the AMSI provider, which would be the antivirus product. And in this specific case here, what will happen though is if when I release a new version of Unicorn, what will happen is Microsoft will release a new detection for it, and usually within a couple of days. So it's always this cat and mouse game. But in order for me to actually write a bypass to get around Windows Defender, literally takes me less than 5 minutes. So it's again such a fragile preventative detection signature that anybody can go and do this. And I've done multiple videos on how to take Unicorn and to modify it so that it gets around the detection, how to detect exactly where inside of that code it's being detected at. But really it's honestly trivial. But this is obviously an example of Unicorn. And if you were to run this command on a system, it would do shellcode injection via Meterpreter directly into memory through PowerShell. But if we look at this other tool that I wrote called Trevor C2, this is a command and control infrastructure that I wrote, and it has a number of different agents. So if you look at the server agent model, server is going to be your listener, and agent is going to be your command and control that gets executed on the system. And there's a number of different versions of this. There's a C version, which is cross-compatible between Windows, Linux, and OS X. So you can cross-compile it to any native binary. Same thing for Java, PowerShell, and Python. Python is cross-compatible via all 3 operating systems as well. But let's just take a look at the PowerShell one. And as an attacker, if what I would obviously do is remove anything that was comment code. I would also change any of the ciphers, time intervals, any of these variable names, changing any of these, and obviously site URL to be your command and control. It could be HTTPS, are all things that I would do. Now, when we start looking into the actual code itself of how this works, we're using legitimate functions within PowerShell to execute this. So we're using, everything from, advanced encryption standard or AES, encrypt string, decrypt string, and then our socket-based, our HTTP-based web request handler directly through PowerShell as well. So all of this stuff here is legitimate code in every way, shape, or form. So writing detections off of this, if it's not obfuscated is very difficult to do because it's legitimate programming. Now you could say, well, if I see, cookie container within that, and then there's 10 lines, and then you see connect Trevor, you can write a detection off of that knowing it's Trevor C2, but those are even more fragile detection criteria. So if you change variable names, which is super simple to do, change basic areas here, you're going to evade most detections that are out there today. And one thing I can say is that this still does to this day, I wrote it 4 years ago, doesn't get detected by Windows Defender. So you can run a full-fledged command and control infrastructure, that is multi-threaded, supports, multiple shells and things to that effect directly through HTTP or HTTPS, right out of the box without any type of detections out there. So, something to take in consideration there. Again, our fragility of detections is a major problem in this industry. So when we talk about castles, there is no castle. Like, I always hear the mentality of organizations try to build these castle walls. And the issue is that there never was a castle. Now, organizations that have done a good job in consistency and baselining, maybe they have a castle, but you look at cloud, you look at BYOD, you look at everything else, it's a mess. Most organizations are a mess, and that's why you see the breaches that you have. There's applications and systems that they never knew existed. There's all of this complexity that we talk about. When we talk about complexity is legacy systems, on-premise, cloud, workstations, laptops, full VPNs, you name it. All of these things introduce complexity. Technology introduces complexity. I always love the argument when I go in organizations. So like, hey, we're thinking about, switching off of Cisco to Palo Alto because Palo Alto sounds more awesome. And I'm like, well, okay, well, let's talk through that. Like, why do you want to go to Palo Alto? Well, they have, next generation firewalls. I'm like, okay, so does Cisco, but let's talk about that. So you have an entire organization that has 15 years, of built up Cisco experience. Okay. And now you're going to completely switch that to a completely different vendor or browser, different vendor and technology stack. And you think that's going to go okay? With everything else you have going on here, where you can barely even keep up the lights in your security program or even in your network infrastructure, and you want to take over this multi-crazy, insane year conversion from this to this. Do you have the staffing for that? Do you have the people? Do you have the expertise? We want to implement a SIM. Okay, well, you don't even have any visibility whatsoever in the first place. Is that the right way for you to go? And I always feel like, we always look at this big picture stuff, which takes years to implement. But when it comes to detection engineering and understanding our environment, it's still a foreign concept to us. And what most organizations would benefit for day one is by investing in detection engineering that is super fast to move and to write new detections continuously, again, throughout that entire life cycle of an attack to get better and better and better what they're doing. So it's those specific things that make a big difference. And again, I'll go into organizations that use EDR products or that use information off of VirusTotal or source threat intelligence that has, common TCPs that are shared across multiple breaches. Again, we as attackers know that, right? So we know that, if we're going into an organization and we're using a research from somebody that is more than a few weeks old, there's probably a good probability that if they're using any type of EDR product that they're going to get detected, right? Just from a commonality TTP perspective. That's shame on us as being an adversary and attacker using that same type of capabilities. But if it's within the first week, first couple of weeks, you look at something like Print Nightmare, took a while to get detections out there, even preventative mechanisms, even to get a patch that worked the right way. I think we had 4 or 5 patches that it took Microsoft to fix that one. You look at other attack avenues, like it just takes a while for those detections to get there. But if we modify those attacks, we customize them in some way, shape, or form, we now have the ability to go in a much larger breadth in organizations that don't have their own detections. Again, when I say your own detections, it's based off of the actual environment in your organization. Hey, we probably have the system account using PowerShell all the time. We probably have all these admins using PowerShell all the time. So let's put exceptions of those in place. Let's look at whenever PowerShell is actually ever executed from a regular user context perspective. What does that look like? Okay, we have 15 applications that use PowerShell. Let's put exceptions in for those. And then now we have this baseline, right? And this baseline is what is normal. And then we have what are deviations of that. Now, deviations may happen, and those could be false positives. It might very well be legitimate, but those are things that we actually need to investigate. And those are why we actually need people looking at things, saying, hey, this isn't legitimate, or hey, this is legitimate, to actually start to work through those. Again, companies are investing in that fast detection engineering piece. And that's what's concerning, is that, in order for us to get better in security, yes, we have to have this grand scheme, large security strategy that takes us years to implement, and we'll eventually get there. And then we're going to have another 3-year strategy and another 3-year strategy to continuously make the security program better. But at the end of the day, if we don't have a fast way to implement things that can help us now, that doesn't require a culture change or a mass, amount of resources, or completely redesigning how users do things, we're going to fail, because we don't have that stopgap in between this part here and when this part here is being implemented to actually address those. We have to be able to move fast and understand what red is doing or what offense is doing, and continuously build those out across our environment. And most companies can't do this. They just don't focus on this one missing link here, this one little piece here around detection engineering, and that continual offensive testing, that continual detection building, that is paramount for us to get better as an industry. Taking that 20% number I threw out before and making it 50% or 80%, it just isn't there. And so our whole goal should be really understanding offense to build our defense, right? And this is a thing where I even look at from a strategy perspective. This is why I question a lot of our leaders in security. They're trying to use what the buzzwords are in the security industry. Hey, we need to put DLP in place. We have to do multi-factor authentication. We have to do this. We have to do this. We have to, redesign all of these different things here. We have to re-architect our network to be zero trust. We have to do all this other stuff here, when they don't even understand the threat models towards their organization or what the capabilities of the adversaries are. There's probably 10 things you can do first and foremost that are much more shorter term objectives that have a much bigger impact on the risk profile to your organization than these massive strategy things that you're talking about that's so far high level that you're never going to probably implement in the first place. I still have not seen a good DLP program in my entire life. Like my entire life, I have not seen a good DLP program. That's something that people talk about. Okay, we need it for compliance. We need it for this. We need it for that. So unless you understand offense, you cannot have a defense. And rephrase that, you'll have a very poor defense. Your defense will not be able to withstand what offense can throw at you. So instead of talking about defense, we need to be talking about what offense can do and what are the ways that we can defend against it. And that's ultimately what this industry is somewhat shifting to, but it's kind of stuck here in the middle. We know that we have to fix these vulnerabilities from a patch management perspective. We know that we have to understand it's more than just initial access. It's about privilege escalation. It's about lateral movement. It's about, persistence. It's about all of these different phases. It's about command and control. It's about defense evasion. It's about all these different areas here, but we don't focus on them. We don't spend the time to understand what's normal in our environment. We just expect a piece of technology to do it for us. And again, we're no different than the signature-based antivirus of the 90s. We're just command line antivirus now of the 2020s. It really hasn't evolved much, except we're actually looking at command line arguments and process relationships. So that's what EDRs are essentially doing. So really our understanding of offense is what's killing us right now on the defensive side. Now, again, I understand why, there's some limitations on what we should be publicly disclosing, right? We probably shouldn't be dropping 0 days. Got it. Responsible disclosure. Got it. Offensive security tools, maybe some arguments there around, why we shouldn't be dropping, certain tools that may have a larger impact when 80% of organizations can't even do the basics. But at the end of the day, we still have to figure out a way to move forward, to be open and honest, and to communicate, and to give organizations the capabilities, the tooling, the testing, the ability to understand how to build defense, so that we can ultimately come out of this and hopefully in a better spot. Never going to say we're perfect. That's never going to happen. But at least to be where it's at from a 20% perspective. Now they're more at maybe it's a 40% perspective or a 50% perspective. And so, we have to continuously move forward. We can't move back. We can't have offense going in the dark again and holding their tools and techniques and exploits and everything else. We need to be transparent and keep moving forward. And hopefully the rest of the organizations will catch up and understand it. Listen, there's more discussions happening now around security than I've ever seen before in my entire life. I'm on the news more than I ever have been in my entire life. I hear boardrooms talking about it. Boardrooms are talking about what are our adversaries doing? What are we doing from a threat modeling perspective? These are people that don't even know how to turn on a computer. So security is working in some aspect. We're communicating the right things, but our leaders also have to be able to understand, hey, this is how I build a security program. This is how we recognize where we have gaps and deficiencies. And this is how we model ourselves to get better over time, but also recognizing that it's going to take us time to get there and supplementing with things like detection engineering and everything else that goes along. So we have to understand the capabilities of attackers. We have to understand how that maps to our environment and how we can build a way to understand where our programs end and continuously move from it. It's interesting. I'll get board presentations quite frequently. And ones that, the very first board presentation they go through, a lot of times, organizations will start to use something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which, has its shortfalls. And I wouldn't say from a framework perspective, but how people try to implement it often has shortfalls. Becomes more of a signature-based driven TTP type framework than it is actually building out detections in your environment, understanding your environment. Again, I digress on that front. But what's interesting is as you start talking to them and saying, listen, hey, board members, here's the 10 groups that want to hack us, okay? Based on our peers, based on what we've seen before in the past, based on attribution that we've done before to understand this. And here's who they are, and here's their capabilities, and here's how our program maps to it. And here's the things that are going to take us some time to get there. And that's why we need staffing, we need funding, we need this, we need that. But we're also supplementing it right here to be able to identify if these attacks happen so that we can respond much more effectively and reduce the risk to the business. That is a clear-cut strategy that is going to have a lot of success versus, hey, I'm going after the NIST capabilities maturity model, and we're mature in this area, we're not mature in this area. No one knows what that means. And like, why are we not mature in that area? And how long is it going to take? 3 years? Really? It's going to take 3 years for you to implement this so that we can hopefully prevent an attack that may happen any day? So high likelihood, high risk, high impact type of attacks and take us 3 years. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We have to be faster. We have to figure out ways to augment things. By slapping a tool out is not going to make that specific thing any important. Some of the basics that work, and these are things that I wish I just saw in normal organizations. This is a normal, should be a basic thing. And I'm not saying basic is easy. Some of this stuff is tough, to go through, to get implemented, to get buy-off in, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a huge fan of application control or allow listing. I think if you can baseline your organization and then you can lock down things to do, like for example, if you put WDAC, Windows Defender Application Control in monitor mode, and you take a list of the living off the land binaries and scripts, do all of your regular users use certutil on a regular basis? Do they use MSHTA? Do they use regSVR32? Do they use run DLL32? Answer that commonly and probably consistently across the board is no, but maybe. And so when you have good understandings of those, why not block the common living off the lands that are notorious to use for remote code execution or download functionality? Like you limited a whole attack surface there, from your Windows environments and everything else. And you start looking at, well, hey, let's try to do the same thing for PowerShell. It's baseline PowerShell, who's using, who's not. Let's lock that down so that regular users like Bob in sales doesn't have a full-fledged programming language at his fingertips. And now you just reduce this attack surface. So now you've reduced noise here, you reduce noise here, and your visibility becomes greater because now you have less things you have to worry about. Now I can start looking at things like parent-child process relations or markup chaining, which is a huge set of value. You could do things like sysmon from a detective perspective, where you're getting kernel level event log tracing for Windows, which is a free tool from Mark Rusenovich's team over at Sysinternals over at Microsoft. Basic things that can make a huge impact in your entire organization are things that we should have as a basic default thing. Constrained language mode out of the gate. Why are we still using PowerShell version 2? Makes no sense whatsoever. Why is PowerShell version 2 the default standard? Why are we not upgrading that and it's out of the default from a Microsoft perspective? Again, all these things that we need to focus on from a basic level perspective that should be incorporated into every program. Detective wise, we have to detection wise, we have to have endpoint logs, north to south, east to west traffic. DNS logs are always hugely valuable. Visibility first, including cloud infrastructure. Most organizations don't have any visibility whatsoever, or very little, or heavily delayed in their cloud infrastructure. And taking an approach that focuses more on understanding threat modeling or adversaries versus we think we're here, we think we're doing that, we think we're good here, we think we're good here. That's thinking that you're okay without any validation whatsoever. We have to get to more frequent offensive testing to understand what's actually occurring out there and to get better. Some of the challenges: 0 days will continue to happen. Commodity attacks will continue to shift and change. Right now, from an EDR perspective, the hope is that, it's very much the same hope as what antivirus was, 20 years ago, was that one of your customers or one of their customers gets hits first and then pushes the detection out to the rest of everybody else so that you're not the first person hit. That's not a position that I'd ever want to be at, from a leadership perspective in an organization running security. I don't ever want to hope that I'm not the first hit. That means that my security program sucks. I'm at a basic level, and that literally, in a basic attacker that's has very little experience in this in the hacking side of the house can literally rip into my organization and compromise it without any type of detections whatsoever. Again, I go back to the fixes, which is understanding your threat models, understanding what the likelihood of those are to happen, and understanding how we can get better visibility into all of our different areas. We shouldn't have full VPN access, getting more towards web-based services, focus on user isolation, server communication restrictions. An interesting example, and I'm closing up here in a second. Interesting example for SolarWinds, which I thought was mind-blowing, is that if you look at how the SolarWinds attack happened from a supply chain perspective, when the update mechanism was hijacked, from a specific APT group, they pushed the update out to various organizations, including Microsoft, Cisco, Intel, VMware, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what was interesting about that is that none of those organizations had egress filtering on their server infrastructure, which is mind-blowing to me that these organizations literally are not doing egress filtering whatsoever, or outbound server filtering. Your server should never be communicating directly to the internet in any way, shape, or form. Why that was even a practice, I have no idea. But that literally would have eliminated the entire SolarWinds piece. Yes, you might have had malicious code running on your computer, but there's no way to establish command and control, thus not allowing the attackers access to your servers in the first place. So the basics are what's killing us in many cases in the industry, and it's really a lack of understanding of offensive capabilities. And again, now there's talk of not releasing tools and not having different tools out there that help testers actually do security testing. That's ridiculous. Like, you do not want us going back 10 years ago to when 100% of the organizations out there couldn't even handle the basics of attacks out there. Yes, we still have 80% of the organizations that are still very much at a commodity level, but that is improving. Companies are starting to focus more on security. We just got to have better leaders in place to go and actually implement these programs. So closing out on this, I want to thank everybody for listening to me today. Hopefully, you learned something new, or you are assured, in the direction of where we're going. Listen, I'm positive of the past 15 years of the industry and where we've kind of come from to where we are today. It's been eye-opening to see, when you run your own assessment firm where you're going into all these organizations, it's eye-opening to see, organizations that really just don't even understand fundamental security principles. They don't understand what offense can be used for. They don't understand what they're doing from a defensive perspective. And it's really on all of us that can communicate this, that can message this, that can push us out to really start to help these organizations get better with what they're doing. At the end of the day, red and blue working together is going to make a much better way of success than, red working for itself and blue working for itself and not understanding one another. The cohesion there has to be there. We have to continue to get better at working and understanding offensive capabilities. We can't just rely off of crowdsource data from adversaries, from a reverse engineering perspective, or what we've seen from a previous breach perspective. We need researchers out there publishing tools, publishing new techniques, responsibly disclosing exploits and exposures, again, within reason. So all of those things are things that are positives that we're doing. I don't see why we need to shift to a different way. We're making progress. We need to continue to make progress, but we need better leaders in place to implement these programs and focus very heavily on understanding adversaries and detection engineering. With that, again, thanks so much for having me today. Sunday at what time is it? 4 o'clock. So hopefully you folks had some good times and learned something new. But I appreciate having me, Mystico.